newspapermen meet such interesting people. They know the lowdown, now it can be told. I'll tell you quite reliably off the record about some charming people I have known. For I meet politicians and grafters by the score, killers plain and fancy, it's really quite a bore. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. They wallow in corruption, crime and gore. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, city desk, full of press, extra, extra, read all about it, it's a mess, meets the test. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. It's wonderful to represent the press. Now you remember Mrs. Sadie.
Media Project gives you a half hour of commentary and analysis every week of what's going on in the news media with some veteran journalists, and we invite you to join us and even share some of your thoughts if you like when you hear what we have to say. I'm Rex Smith, former editor of the Times-Union, now with the Upstate American, here with some of my colleagues, Judy Patrick, former editor of the Daily Gazette, now with the New York Press Association, Barbara Lombardo, who was the executive editor of the Saratogian and the Troy Record, and Ian Pickus, the news director of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Here we all are.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. Here we go. Actually, we need to start with sports because I think what is going on right now in the most important area of sports coverage is indicative of how much media coverage has changed. And I'm talking about sort of the eruption, the decline, the explosion, implosion of Sports Illustrated. Ian, tell us, if you would, please, what happened there?
Maybe we can tie it to another big story this week, which was the layoffs at the LA Times newsroom. I'll give you my perspective on this. Sports Illustrated, as I understand it, was purchased, by a company more as a brand than a magazine operation, and it sounds like it's in its death throes at this point. People have been laid off 3 months from now. The future is very unclear for what really was one of the most important magazines of the last century, and it set the tone for sports coverage. It was culturally important to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Now it's a monthly. Who knows? One thing in that story that stood out to me was the fact that its online hits are on the rise, however, even now in its incredibly diminished form. But maybe this is illustrative of a change in the media. Sports today and the way we consume it is a lot of video podcasting. It's the Kelsey brothers. It's the Manning cast. The appetite for the long form, 20,000 word feature on the backup catcher maybe has diminished some. But I was thinking about Sports Illustrated and the LA Times, if you'll permit me to go on here, because I was at the LA Times in 2005 for a annual student sports media multi-day conference back when I was sports obsessed and working for Barb. And it was in honor of the late, great Jim Murray, who was an LA Times legend who also worked for Sports Illustrated. And that was in a different era for newspapers like the LA Times, when they could afford to fly in 24 students from around the country for 3 days of instruction at the LA Times. And when you read the news this week about SI and the LA Times, it makes it seem like, now that was 2005, we probably will never go back to a situation like that. It's hard enough to have an intern nowadays.
It's so significant that Sports Illustrated, which had 3 million subscribers when it was owned by Time Inc., now the print product is virtually gone. But it's interesting you say that their online traffic has actually increased. But one of the things that is coming out of it, I think, when you talk about the podcast world, there is now talk about how much of sports coverage is actually owned and operated by the teams themselves, and how people turn to that, totally eliminating the opportunity for objectivity, right? For fairness.
Exactly. And what you're losing with Sports Illustrated's diminishment is those great long-form pieces that showed how wonderful sports writing can be. I'm not into sports, but I loved reading Sports Illustrated stories because they wove a tale so expertly. They explained what was happening from track and field to baseball to football to minor sports. Maybe it speaks to the fact that we're not reading as much as we used to. The Los Angeles Times, they were one of my go-to major dailies. That's one of the sites I would visit because they had a different perspective, and losing what they lost a third or a quarter of their newsroom, we're losing that perspective. It was different than the Washington Post. It was different than the Boston Globe and the New York Times. And it's a major daily, and the cuts there were just horrendous. It is a horrible loss for Sports Illustrated, although, you know what? Sports Illustrated has never been as good a product to me ever since they started putting the little swimsuit editions out. Sorry, but I just never got past that.
But we've all been through newsrooms reducing size. It seemed for a while that with some billionaires taking over of the Washington Post, in the case of Jeff Bezos, of the LA Times, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, now it shows that even if you have a billionaire owner, you're not immune from the forces on the marketplace, right?
That's sadly true. And as far as Sports Illustrated, I used to enjoy reading Rick Riley's column. I thought it was just really well written. I remember they'd have little features about up-and-coming stars in the sports world, young people, right?
And that was a big deal when, if your local person was in the Faces in the Crowd, that was a story
Faces
on
in
its
the
own.
Crowd.
Right.
That's what it was called.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe you mentioned it, Rex, that what's happening now is that so much of what people want to get from sports, they are getting from things that are provided by the teams themselves. And if they haven't figured out how to make money off of the stories that they would sell, I mean, how's The Athletic doing now?
Right. Well, The Athletic was bought up by the Times, and
The Times
it has
dropped its
replaced
sports
the
coverage.
Times sports section altogether, and that's paywalled. And The Athletic is, I mean, it's a good alternative to what Sports Illustrated used to offer. But you're right. Now, growth is in places like the Players Tribune, which, you know, my childhood idol Derek Jeter launched to give athletes the chance to write and publish essays without having to go through media.
Journalists.
Oh,
That is a huge change
you know what?
for
There
us.
is a market available then for politicians to do the same.
There you go. Well, but think about what's happening now with ownership. ESPN, which has been just tremendously profitable for Disney and for its lesser owners. I used to work for Hearst, which owned 20% of ESPN for many years, and it was just a cash cow. ESPN now is looking for investors to take it over and is considering selling part of itself to NFL. Isn't that correct? And wouldn't that tend to, if you were the executive producer of ESPN, the president of the network, I think you would be very reluctant to take on the NFL if that owns a huge chunk of your operation. And consolidation is happening. The WWE has taken over.
Netflix and the WWE have signed a deal.
Yeah, Netflix and WWE. So the media information marketplace is increasingly A, consolidating, and B, coming under control of people who are not independent, which has been fundamental.
Yeah, with ESPN, they've been in bed with the leagues to a degree for many, many years. But you are seeing shows like Outside the Lines, hosted by Bob Lee, who was an old school sports journalist, or the Dick Schaps and the Jeremy Schaps, who would do real journalism around sports. That is expensive in its own right. I mean, I remember talking to Jeremy Schaap about his reporting trips to Qatar ahead of the World Cup, where he exposed virtual slavery that people were working in to build these stadiums. Now, if you're ESPN and you're televising the World Cup, it's probably not in your interest to do that type of journalism. And with the NFL, which is the biggest sports product that's made, I mean, yes, you're going to see a lot less critical coverage from a network that is in business with the NFL explicitly.
Certainly, you're not going to, I don't think, see that network doing takeouts, significant features on, say, the brain injury sustained by football players, by what advances in technology of helmets might be able to do to save people, or even changing the rules somewhat. Or the fact that now the NBA, basically everyone has begun to see it as a contact sport. Basketball wasn't generally thought of as a contact sport until these last few years. And that is basketball going to become what hockey is? But the things that you need good journalists on is the ties between organized crime and sports, or the places in which there is corruption, as you pointed out, Ian, where the construction and so on, or even the subsidies for stadia that are being built, like for the Buffalo Bills. Not meaning any disrespect to the Bills, of course, since we're existing here in New York State.
But so much of sports journalism also is cheerleading, I think, of particular sports. And you have to separate that from the true sports journalism, which is getting into the investigation and holding people accountable. But also I will drag into that category, the true profiles, the true features that were just wonderful. And I guess it just reflects what the sports fans want. Do they just want the score? But of any sports fan I know, they love to talk about a particular call by a ref or how a coach played a game, and you would think that they wanted an objective analysis of
I don't think that management is so concerned about what readers want. I think they're concerned about what they can get advertising dollars for.
What about, though, thinking of sports coverage, I always found it difficult editing a newspaper in the shadow of the Saratoga Racecourse to get thoughtful, critical coverage of the horse racing industry, right?
Exactly, because the reporters are sitting in a press box. I think they get a lot of perks. They are advocates for the sport, just like arts writers are advocates for ballet or advocates for the orchestra. I mean, in some respects, people who cover government are advocates for democracy, I guess. But yeah, I agree with you about the coverage for horse racing could be fawning.
Mm-hmm.
The Times-Union did, I thought, an incredible job with a series of stories about the problems with horse racing, the deaths of the horses, and the oversight of the industry, focusing on with Saratoga as a hook to that.
I can say that it came several years late, and since I was the editor during those several years, I can say with mea culpa, because it was almost like the slap in the face required that coverage.
Yeah,
right?
And did you find that this was and probably still is an issue with when you have people covering a beat, that they may not be the right people to cover all aspects of the elements of that beat? So if you're telling somebody to cover sports, they are going to be more of the game coverage and what the coaches had to say, strategies about the play, but they are not the people that are going to go into the budget issues and the doping issues. It's a different type of reporter. I mean, ideally, it should be both types. We like to talk about the political coverage. You're writing about the horse race, but you're not writing about the issues, and they almost feel part of it might be their level of ability and part of it might be where they're coming from, that they have been sucked into that. They believe those experts, the authority of the people that they're covering.
Well, how do you get someone, if you are going to write a very critical story about the mayor, how do you get the mayor's chief of staff to talk to you the next morning once that story appears? I mean, this is actually a constant problem for reporters at all levels, keeping the stories going when you have to actually be tough and report what people on your beat don't really want to see.
Well, haven't there been stories about cities where, I think it was Buffalo maybe, the mayor wouldn't talk to the reporter for years and years because they
a
didn't
lot of stories like that.
Especially in Utica as well. That happened quite frequently. But that is one of the tricks of the trade. You have to establish yourself as being fair-minded. And over the years, I've found that reporters who are tough and do the tough stories tend to get the tips, tend to get the callbacks more so than the reporters that just avoid the critical stories. It's just good guy reporters tend to finish last.
We've talked about it on the show before, but the maxim is stab them in the heart and not the back, and they will have some respect for that, especially with respect to the racing industry, which is such an insular world. I remember being in the press box there one day when everyone would rather write about who won the feature race that afternoon, and Governor Spitzer did a gaggle about the potential change in ownership of the racing industry in New York when NYRA was under one of the many times it's been under a cloud. And the reporters were the same people who were covering the industry and the result of the day. And you are absolutely right. That is a tricky thing to pull off.
Yeah, and it always has been. And sometimes the targets of the reporting will take after the business as opposed to taking after the reporter. In our community, this was when the Democratic machine in Albany cracked down on the Times-Union in the 1970s and refused to provide the tax break that the Times-Union needed to expand its headquarters down in downtown Albany. And Hearst decided to move the paper out to Colony. So there you go, Mayor Corning. It was interesting, but it was because they were upset about the coverage of such people as Bill Kennedy, who was then writing about urban issues for the Times-Union, that that kind of thing happened. That kind of coverage, though, is not only hard to do, but it's also expensive because it takes time. And again, we're coming back to the financial issues here. It's harder to make that happen when your staff has been decimated, as the LA Times, as you say, has just lost 200 people from the newsroom. A remarkable impact there. Well, these are tough times, actually. Chaos, they say at the Los Angeles Times, because their top 3 editors have resigned, 200 layoffs. It's really quite a lot of drama for what is the largest newsroom in the western United States, and we'll kind of have to keep an eye on it because it is indicative of a lot of what's going on. It's the Media Project from Northeast Public Radio. I'm Rex Smith here with Judy, Patrick, Barbara Lombardo, and Ian Pickus. And if you would like to share your thoughts on any of the issues we're talking about, media@wamc.org is how you can send us email. I don't think we have any interesting emails today, but, we're always happy to hear from you. By the way, we have to talk about politics just because it's interesting. And I just love this story that Sean Hannity of Fox News, which is, of course, a mislabeled operation. There's no news on Fox.
Is he still on the air?
Oh, is he? The stock market, hit a new high, all-time high on the stock market. And Hannity used to make such a big deal out of this under the Trump administration. By golly, isn't Donald Trump terrific? He says, well, yeah, it's not such a big deal. It can go down as quickly as it goes up. It has nothing to do with Joe Biden. So I just want to point this out to our listeners who may have some support for Fox News lingering in their minds. Folks, don't pay attention. It's not true.
Right, and the article mentions all the times when Sean Hannity said that this was an important issue. This was an important benchmark. It's just like the gas prices. Remember, anti-Biden people, or especially in the media, were jumping on the fact that gas was maybe $4 or $5 a gallon. Now that it's come down, you don't hear that anymore. You don't see the trips to the gasoline station where it's $8 a gallon. I think that it's selective coverage of events, and the hypocrisy is never called out. And in Sean Hannity's case, it needs to be.
I remember in the Trump administration hearing a lot of analysis from people who play the game for a living saying, you as a president do not celebrate the stock market because it does go down inevitably, and then you have to wear that. So, yeah, I mean, if you look at the transcript in this story, it's dozens of times that Hannity was listing it as an accomplishment. So now it's a different person in the White House. It doesn't count.
Right. It does make me wonder about what we in the normal people, mainstream media, how we reported it when Trump was shouting about how great the stock market was doing under his tenure, and did we say that only 8% of citizens have? How often did we also get sucked into reporting that as news, and that gets into people's heads?
It's easy stuff to report. It's like reporting politics as sports. It's like reporting it as who's winning, who's losing, who's up, which is what we heard so much of in the aftermath of the New Hampshire primary, right?
If I could quote Kai Ryssdal from Marketplace, heard on this station, the stock market is not the economy.
Yeah, he does say that all the time. I love that.
And as a reader from Valley Falls can remind us, we don't really know how to report about the economy anyway.
Yeah.
But I am concerned about, now when the stock market does hit a high, how should that be reported correctly? Should we be saying now under President Biden it's a high, which is true, but that it's not because of the president. It's a very small factor about the economy. It doesn't affect most people's lives. How should we be reporting that?
Right,
not like Hannity,
because it trickles down to the mainstream voter. If you heard some of the coverage of the New Hampshire primary, for example, you had people coming out saying, "Yeah, I voted for one or the other because of the economy." What facts from the economy are they using to make their decision that the economy is bad?
Facts.
Is it the fact that the price of eggs was high, or that Sean Hannity says the stock market doesn't matter? We're not doing a good job of bringing the economic news to the people. It's complicated. It's numbers. A lot of people have trouble with numbers.
And it's not as exciting as the political contest. I defy most people to be able to describe the policy differences between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. Where do they stand differently from each other on the issues? Their personalities are certainly different. Maybe that's how voters make a decision. But typically, we don't focus our coverage on giving people the information about what a difference it would make as to who's in the White House. And that is simply, in fact, we've gotten over this a little bit, but when Donald Trump first appeared on the scene politically as a presidential candidate, the network executives thought it was just terrific because he was going to be lively. I mean, I'm looking at this quote from Les Moonves, who is the head of CBS News in 2015. He was just giddy about Donald Trump running. He told investors, presidential election's around the corner, and thank God the rancor has already begun. Go, Donald, keep getting out there. He thought it was just great. And I think
Ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching.
We did read a critical essay this week that made that point that, the Trump business is good for media outlets in some ways. I don't know what the alternative is. I mean, we've talked about this on the show many, many times. Let's say he's the president again. The things he says are newsworthy, and I still don't know that we have figured out a way around that.
Yeah, it's true. It's hard because it went for the victory speech after the New Hampshire primary. He said, well, CNN and NBC refused to air it, and they're dishonest, and they should have their licenses taken away.
Their licenses or whatever it is.
Yeah, or whatever it is.
Yeah, so there's that whole discussion about whether to take Trump literally or seriously. I do both. And we may not have to worry about how we would be reporting on him under a Trump administration when they start closing stations and pressuring the owners to put things on or to not put certain things on.
The argument's being made that people should be required to listen from start to finish to a Trump speech and not just have the media take out, the wild and crazy things or the stumbles he makes. If they listen to the whole thing from start to finish, they would get a far better sense of his capacity to handle the stresses of presidency.
Don't care. They don't care. And nothing personal. They don't care. And how many times during his prior election campaign seasons did the Fox News air? They aired all of his rallies, so they heard everything, including his missteps. And
boy, it's getting a lot worse, though, isn't it? I mean, am I misunderstanding? But he can't keep. Well, of course, when you mix up Nikki Haley and
Nancy Pelosi,
that's pretty bad.
It was just more. It was more than once. It was 5 or 6 times, and that was Nancy Pelosi or when Nikki Haley was in charge of security at the Capitol on January 6th.
Oh, you guys are picking on Trump again.
And his potential vice presidential candidate, Stefanik.
Speaking of which, before we leave the topic of hypocrisy, I did want to just raise her gaggle in New Hampshire, Congresswoman Stefanik, when she was stumping for Trump and was asked if she believes E. Jean Carroll, the Trump accuser, who a jury believed. And she said, no, of course not. The media is biased against Donald Trump. And I dug up the 2021 statement that she issued saying Governor Andrew Cuomo should be arrested after the AG found that Cuomo sexually harassed and assaulted multiple women. So
she wants
sometimes it's
arrest.
helpful to check the record.
That's
I'm
wonderful.
shocked.
There's great. That's a journalistic practice. So she thinks that Cuomo should have been arrested for an allegation, but Trump it's biased against Trump after a jury has found that he raped her.
And this questioning by the reporter in the gaggle is worth all reporters watching because it was fact questions. It was, do you believe? No, it was not the media that ruled. It was a jury, and she didn't ultimately, concede the point, but it's a good 5 minutes of
So the reporter
viewing.
did say it was a jury.
Yeah.
Did the job. One more thing, folks, before we go, and that is crime coverage. I just want to cite a statistic that came from Poynter, the Media Study Center. The United States got safer between 1993 and 2019. Actually, crime fell 34% from 1991 to 2000, but stories about crime focused on homicide rose by over 700%. So journalism overrepresents communities that are underprivileged in crime coverage and focuses too heavily on crime, right? What do we do about it? How do you change that?
I would take one step back, and hearing a statistics, crime fell 34%, which sounds great. I'm skeptical about even numbers like that. Based on what type of crimes, what level of crimes, where did these crimes occur? So I don't know. But if I accept the general idea that crime has declined, on the local level, people still love to read about local crime and what's going on in their community. And it's not a proud moment for most journalists. I see the Times-Union is struggling now with whether to when and if to put the defendant's name in a story. There was one that
The defendant, you mean the victim's name in a story?
no, I mean the defendant's name in a
Really?
story. Just read one about a guy who stole a cat, and the cat's missing and might be dead, and somebody that a lot of people would know about. Anyway, it is a problem. It does affect people of color and disproportionately. I remember that at the Saratogian, our bosses, they might have been your bosses at one time in Troy, demanded that we include the headshots of people who were committing crimes because people love to see the pictures.
That's a whole nother topic. We're actually out of time. Let's come back to this topic because
It is a good topic.
this notion of trying to prioritize public safety and community impact over crime incidents is an interesting thought about journalism in our time. That's all we have time for, though, folks. You can share your thoughts at media@wamc.org. With us, the media projectors today, Barbara Lombardo, Judy Patrick, Ian Pickus, and I'm Rex Smith. We are grateful to our producer, David Gustina, for making this happen, and to you folks for joining us this week, as you can again every week at this time here on The Media Project.
They used to work like hell just for romance, but finally the movies notwithstanding, they all got tired of patches on their pants. They organized a union to get a living wage. They joined with other actors upon a living stage. Now newspapermen are such a...
The Media Project is a national production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. This week's projectors include former Times-Union editor and current Substack columnist of the Upstate American, Rex Smith, Judy Patrick, former editor of the Daily Gazette and vice president for editorial development for the New York Press Association, Barbara Lombardo, the former editor of the Saratogian and a journalism professor at the University at Albany, and WAMC news director Ian Pickus. You can listen to the Media Project anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. I'm your producer, David Gustina. Thanks for listening.
Complain. But publishers have worries, for publishers must go to working folks for readers and to big shots for their dough. Now publishers are such interesting people. It could be prostitution, I don't know. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, circulation, ting-a-ling-a-ling, advertising, get those readers, get that payoff. What a headache, what a mess. Oh, publishers are such interesting people. Let's give 3 cheers for freedom of the press.